The silence in the house was a living thing, a coiled snake in the corner of every room. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of dread, a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from the threads of held breaths and unspoken words. Nora Bell knew its texture better than she knew her own skin. At 16, she was a cartographer of fear, every contour of the small ranch house mapped with the treacherous geography of her stepfather's moods. The scrape of his chair, the clink of a whiskey bottle against glass, the weight of his tread on the worn floorboards, these were her landmarks, her warnings of seismic shifts in the domestic landscape. Her mother moved through this terrain like a ghost, a woman worn thin by the abrasive friction of a life lived on the defensive. Her shoulders were permanently hunched, as if perpetually bracing for a blow, and her smiles were rare, fleeting artifacts from a forgotten time, like pressed flowers in a book she no longer opened. Today the silence was particularly venomous. Ezra Blackwood sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. The afternoon sun, so brilliant and unforgiving outside, was reduced to a hazy, resentful glare through the grimy window pane. He hadn't spoken in an hour, just stared at the swirling amber liquid in his glass, his thick, calloused hands resting on the table. But it was the stillness of his right hand that held Nora captive. It wasn't relaxed. It was clenched, a knot of bone and sinew, the knuckles white. It was a fist waiting for a reason. Nora, standing by the sink, pretended to scrub a pot that was already clean, her own muscles rigid. She could smell him from across the room, the sour tang of sweat, the stale residue of cigarettes, and the sharp, cloying stench of whiskey that seemed to emanate from his very pores. It was the smell of rage, fermenting. The trigger, when it came, was impossibly small. A tremor in her mother's hand as she set a plate of leftover stew on the table, a sound no louder than a sighing floorboard. But in the charged atmosphere, it was a lightning strike. Ezra's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot and murky with self-pity, fixed on her mother. "What was that?" he slurred, his voice a low growl. "Nothing, Ezra. Just the plate." Her mother's voice was a wisp of smoke, easily dissipated. "Sounded like you had something to say." He leaned forward, the chair groaning in protest. The clenched fist on the table tightened further. "You think I don't see you? Scurrying around here like a goddamn mouse, whispering with her." His gaze flicked to Nora, pinning her to the sink. The accusation was the same as always. A conspiracy of women against him. A world that refused to bend to the shape of his broken pride. Nora's heart began a frantic, panicked drumming against her ribs. She saw the sequence of events spooling out before her, a film she had seen too many times. The accusation, the denial, the escalation, the violence. But something was different today. Maybe it was the suffocating heat of the Arizona summer pressing in, or the way the silence had stretched beyond its breaking point. Maybe it was the absolute final emptiness she saw in her mother's eyes, a void where hope used to be. A switch flipped in Nora's mind, not a conscious decision, but a primal, instinctual command from a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. Run. She didn't grab anything. No water, no food, no keys. To pause was to be caught. She dropped the pot into the sink with a clatter that shattered the tension. In that split second of Ezra's startled blink, she was moving. She darted past the living room, past the faded photographs of a life before him, and wrenched open the front door. The blast of desert heat was a physical blow, but it was a clean one. She slammed the door behind her and sprinted, her bare feet pounding against the packed dirt of the yard. She heard the scrape of Ezra's chair, a roared curse, and then the slam of the door again. She didn't look back. She knew he wouldn't follow on foot. He was a horseman, and his cruelty was always mounted. She ran for the fence line, for the vast, indifferent wilderness that began where their blighted property ended. The town was 5 miles down the dirt road, but he would expect that. He would catch her on that road in minutes. The desert, however, The desert was hers. Her real father, the one in the faded photographs, had taught her its secrets, its hidden paths, its cruel mercies. It was a monster, yes, but it was an honest one. Its dangers were not born of malice or self-pity. She scrambled under the barbed wire, feeling a barb rip a long, hot line across her back, a parting gift from Ezra's world. And then she was in it. The creosote bushes, the skeletal fingers of Ocotillo, the treacherous ground littered with stones and cholla. The heat was a physical presence, wrapping around her, stealing the breath from her lungs. The sun was a hammer, but all of it, the heat, the thorns, the burning in her lungs, was secondary. A distant hum beneath the one sound that mattered, the rhythmic pounding beat that had already begun. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of hooves. His horse, a mean-spirited gelding named Satan, was as much a part of his rage as his fists. The sound grew louder, steadier. He was coming. Nora was no longer a girl running from a house. She was prey, fleeing a human monster into the arms of a natural one, and for now, the human monster was the only one that mattered. The sound of a single horse behind her was the only sound in the world. The desert was a furnace, and Nora was a flicker of motion within its shimmering heart. Every breath was an effort, a sip of superheated air that did little to quell the fire in her chest. The ground was an enemy, sharp rocks bruising the soles of her feet, the spines of a fallen cholla cactus embedding themselves in her ankle like a spray of glass shards. She didn't stop to pull them out. The pain was a distant signal, drowned out by the metronome of terror behind her. Thump, 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 thump. The sound was relentless, a predator's heartbeat closing in. She knew this land. She knew to follow the subtle dips in the terrain, the ancient dried-up arroyos that offered slightly softer footing and a measure of cover. She zigzagged, not in a straight line, trying to use the sparse cover of palo verde trees and saguaro cacti to break his line of sight. Her mind, sharpened by adrenaline, became a repository of desert lore. Watch for rattlers in the shade of rocks. The juice of a prickly pear can quench thirst, but the needles will torment you for days. Follow the line of cottonwoods to find water, but he knows that too. These were lessons from her father, taught on long walks in a better time. His voice was a ghost in her memory, a calm counterpoint to Ezra's guttural roars, which were now carried on the wind, distorted and animalistic. The memories were a lifeline and a torment, a reminder of a safety she no longer possessed. Ezra was not a creature of the deep desert. He was a man of fences and roads. His knowledge ended where the manicured pain of his ranch gave way to the wild, untended pain of the wilderness. This was her only advantage. He was powerful, but his power was linear. The desert was not. She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was a dark shape on the horizon, maybe 200 yards back, silhouetted against the bleeding sun. A centaur of wrath, man and horse moving as one. Even from this distance, she could feel the force of his anger, a palpable wave of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He was enjoying this. The chase was a validation of his power, a way to impose his will on the world that so often disappointed him. For him, this wasn't a desperate flight. It was a hunt, and she was the prize. The thought sent a new, colder spike of fear through her. This wasn't just about catching her. It was about breaking her. She pushed harder, her bare feet now raw and bleeding. The landscape began to change. The open flats gave way to a more broken country, a maze of small, eroded canyons and rocky outcrops. This was her territory. She scrambled up a scree slope, the loose rocks sliding under her feet, sending a cascade of pebbles rattling down behind her. It was a risk. The noise would give away her position, but the higher ground would allow her to see, to plan. She reached a small ledge, shielded by a cluster of boulders, and crouched, gasping for air, her body trembling with exhaustion. She peered through a gap in the rocks. Ezra had stopped. He was scanning the landscape, his frustration evident even in his posture. He was losing her scent in this labyrinth of stone and shadow, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in her chest. And then the soundscape changed. It began as a vibration, a low thrumming she felt in the soles of her feet and the bones of her chest before she heard it. It was not the singular, sharp rhythm of Ezra's horse. This was a deeper, more complex sound, a bass note that resonated with the very rock she was pressed against. It grew steadily, a rumble becoming a roar. It wasn't thunder. The sky was a merciless, cloudless blue. Nora's desert-trained ears searched for a source, a meaning. It was the sound of hooves. Not one horse, but dozens. 100. The ground itself seemed to be alive, trembling with a primal energy. From her vantage point, she saw it. Over a distant ridge to the north, a cloud of dust bloomed against the sky, a golden plume in the late afternoon light. And out of that dust they came. The wild herd. It wasn't a stampede, a mindless, panicked flight. They moved with a terrifying, fluid intelligence. At their head was a stallion, a magnificent creature black as polished obsidian, his body a roadmap of scars that spoke of countless battles for dominance. He was larger than the others, a king moving with his court. They flowed down the ridge and into the basin, their bodies a rippling tide of brown, black, and dun. They were the soul of this place, an embodiment of the desert's untamable spirit. Nora watched in horrified awe. She had seen the herd before, but always from a safe distance, a beautiful moving tapestry on a faraway hill. Now they were here, a force of nature unleashed. Her awe curdled back into terror as she realized their trajectory. They were not passing through. They were converging on the basin where she and Ezra were. Her small human drama was about to be swallowed by something far older and more powerful. She looked for Ezra. He had seen them too. He sat frozen on his horse, which was now skittish, its ears twitching, its head tossing nervously. The confident hunter of a moment ago was gone. In his place was a small, trespassing man, suddenly aware that he had wandered into the territory of a god. The herd, which had been a wide, flowing river, began to split, flanking them. They weren't running from anything. They were executing a maneuver. They moved with the predatory precision of a wolf pack, their movements coordinated, purposeful. The black stallion at their head had lowered his neck, his eyes fixed on the intruder in his domain. Not on Nora, hidden and still among the rocks. On Ezra, on the scent of a strange horse, the unnatural presence of a saddle and a man. The thundering of the herd was deafening now, an earth-shaking symphony of power. It swallowed Ezra's curses, swallowed the panicked whinnies of his mount, swallowed the sound of Nora's own ragged breathing. In a shocking, terrifying reversal, the hunter had become the hunted. The wild horses were not just passing by, they were closing a circle, and both Nora and her tormentor were trapped inside. The singular terror of Ezra's pursuit was dwarfed by this new, elemental fear. She had fled a man, only to be cornered by a legend. The desert was no longer indifferent. It had chosen a side. The circle of horses tightened, a living, breathing corral of muscle and instinct. The air was thick with dust and the wild, musky scent of the herd. Nora pressed herself flatter against the rock, trying to make herself a part of the stone. She was a spectator to a primal drama, her own fear a small, sharp point in the vast, thundering chaos. Ezra, in the center of the basin, was a study in panicked bravado. He yanked on the reins of his terrified gelding, trying to spin the horse to face the encroaching threat, but the animal was lost to him, its training erased by the overwhelming presence of the wild herd. It sidestepped, crow-hopped, its eyes rolling white with fear. The black stallion, the architect of this maneuver, had slowed to a walk, his movements deliberate, menacing. He approached Ezra not with the speed of a charge, but with the gravitas of a judge. He was magnificent and terrifying. Scars crisscrossed his powerful neck and haunches, testaments to a life of violent sovereignty. One ear was torn. He was not a creature of pristine beauty, but of earned, brutal power. He stopped 20 feet from Ezra, pawing the ground, his head held high, a clear and unambiguous challenge. The rest of the herd held their positions, a silent, watchful jury. Ezra, finally realizing the futility of controlling his mount, did the one thing he knew how to do when cornered. He resorted to pointless violence. He spurred his horse savagely, kicking its sides, trying to force it forward, to break through the living wall. The gelding, caught between the fear of its master's spurs and the greater terror of the stallion, let out a high-pitched scream of panic and reared, unseating Ezra in a clumsy, undignified heap. Ezra hit the ground hard, the air exploding from his lungs. For a moment, he was just a man in the dust, gasping and stunned. His horse, finally free, bolted, galloping blindly until it was absorbed into the shifting mass of the wild herd, a domestic animal swallowed by its ancestral past. The stallion ignored the fleeing gelding. His focus remained on the man. Ezra staggered to his feet, his face a mask of dirt and fury. He was weaponless, unhorsed, and surrounded. His pride, the brittle foundation of his being, was shattered. He screamed at the stallion, a string of impotent curses lost in the vastness of the desert. The stallion responded with a snort, a plume of dust jetting from his nostrils. He took another step forward. This was Nora's chance. While the herd's attention was fixed on Ezra, the circle had gaps, moments of flux. If she could move now, she could slip away. Survival instinct warred with a paralyzing awe. She had to move. She began to crawl backward, away from her vantage point, sliding down the other side of the rocky outcrop. The stones were sharp, but she barely felt them. Her focus was on silence, on invisibility. She moved with the slow, deliberate care of a lizard, keeping her body low to the ground. She reached the bottom of the rocks and paused, listening. The thundering had subsided, replaced by an unnerving collection of snorts, stomps, and the heavy breathing of many large animals. The confrontation was still in progress. She began to run again, but this time it was different. There was no single sound of pursuit behind her. The terror was now ambient all around her. She ran toward a landmark she knew from childhood, a narrow, sheer-walled canyon carved by millennia of flash floods. It was a place she and her father had called the Skinny Canyon. Its entrance was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. It was defensible. It was safe. It led, she knew, to a small hidden cave about 50 yards in, a pocket in the rock face, cool and dark, her childhood hiding place. It was the perfect sanctuary. She found the entrance, a dark slash in the sandstone wall. She didn't hesitate, squeezing her thin frame through the opening. The rock was cool against her skin, a relief after the oppressive heat. Inside, the canyon walls rose 100 feet on either side, blocking out the sun and muting the sounds of the outside world. The thrumming of the herd became a distant, muffled heartbeat. She was safe. She leaned against the cool rock, her legs finally giving out, and slid to the sandy canyon floor. The silence here was different from the silence at the house. This was a deep, geological silence, a peace that was millions of years old. She took a breath, then another, the air clean and tasting of stone and shade. Relief washed over her in a wave so powerful it made her dizzy. She had made it. She had escaped him. She rested for a few minutes, letting her heart rate slow, letting the terror recede from a roaring inferno to a manageable ember. Then, using the canyon wall for support, she pulled herself to her feet and began to walk deeper, toward the cave. The sand was soft under her bleeding feet. She ran a hand along the sandstone, tracing the water-carved patterns. She remembered being here as a small child, her father lifting her up to see a fossilized shell embedded in the rock. The memory was so clear, so painful, it almost brought her to her knees again. She reached the cave. It was just as she remembered, a shallow opening, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet high, leading back into a space no bigger than a closet. A perfect, secret room. She ducked inside, the darkness absolute for a moment before her eyes adjusted. The air was cool and still. This was it, her fortress. She could wait here. Wait for the herd to move on. Wait for Ezra to give up, to limp back to the road, defeated. The thought of his defeat was a balm. She sat down, her back against the far wall of the cave, and finally allowed herself to inspect her injuries. Her feet were a mess of cuts and bruises. The gash on her back stung. Her ankle throbbed where the cholla spines were embedded. She began to pull them out one by one, a series of sharp, biting pains. As she worked, a sound from outside the cave made her freeze. A scraping sound, rock on rock, followed by a low, pained groan that was terrifyingly human. Nora's blood went cold. The fragile piece shattered into a million icy shards. She held her breath, straining to listen. Another scrape, closer this time, the sound of a heavy body dragging itself along the canyon floor. And then a voice, ragged and hoarse with pain and fury, echoed off the narrow canyon walls. "I know you're in here, you little bitch." It was Ezra. The wild horses, in their act of surrounding him, had not been a force of liberation for her. They had been an instrument of fate. They had driven him off his horse, wounded him, and funneled him, by sheer terrible coincidence, into the one place Nora had chosen as her sanctuary. The canyon's narrow entrance, her shield, was now her prison gate. He was blocking the only way out. Nora scrambled to the mouth of her small cave, peering out into the narrow strip of the canyon. And she saw him. He was about 30 yards away, near the entrance, his body slumped against the canyon wall. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His face was caked in blood and dust, a grotesque mask of agony and hate. He was using his hands to pull himself along the sand, inch by excruciating inch. He hadn't seen her yet. He just knew. He knew she would have run to ground, and this canyon was the most logical place. Her sanctuary had become a tomb. The vast, open desert that had terrified her with its emptiness now seemed like an impossible paradise. All that space, all that air had been reduced to this suffocating, coffin-like corridor of rock, and at its entrance, blocking the light, was the monster she had fled, wounded, cornered, and more dangerous than he had ever been before. The horrified awe she had felt watching the herd had turned to a new, more intimate, and claustrophobic terror. The place of salvation had become a trap, and she was in it with him. The silence that fell in the narrow canyon was absolute, a stark contrast to the thundering chaos that had driven them both here. It was a silence filled with the rasp of Ezra's breathing and the frantic, silent pounding of Nora's own heart. He hadn't moved from the entrance, his broken body a grotesque sentinel guarding the only escape. He knew she was here. The canyon was a dead end, and he had all the time in the world. He was hurt, but his hatred was a fuel that burned hotter than pain. Nora retreated back into the deeper shadows of her small cave, pressing herself against the cold stone. Her mind raced, sifting through impossible options. There was no other way out. The canyon walls were sheer, unclimbable. The cave itself was just a pocket, not a tunnel. She was trapped. Every childhood memory of this place, every moment of remembered safety and wonder, was now tainted, inverted. The cool, dark space that had been her hiding place from imaginary monsters was now a cage shared with a real one. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Ezra's voice echoed, thin and stretched with pain. "Running out here. This is your fault." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "All of it. My leg. My horse. It's all your fault." The familiar litany of blame. Nothing was ever his fault. Not the whiskey, not the rage, not the fear that radiated from him like a sickness. It was always her. Her mother. The world. His self-pity was a bottomless well, and he was determined to drown everyone else in it with him. Nora remained silent, making her breathing as shallow as possible. Maybe, just maybe, if he thought she wasn't here, he would eventually pass out from the pain. It was a flimsy hope, and she knew it. Hours crawled by. The sliver of sky visible from the canyon floor shifted from the pale blue of late afternoon to the fiery orange and deep purple of sunset. The shadows in the canyon deepened, turning from gray to black. The temperature began to drop. Nora shivered, the cold seeping into her bones, a stark contrast to the furnace of the day. Her thirst was a living thing in her throat, a ball of sandpaper. Her body ached with a deep, pervasive weariness. But she did not move. She watched the dark shape of Ezra, a slumped silhouette against the dying light. He hadn't moved either, save for the occasional pained shift or muttered curse. He was waiting, a predator conserving its energy. The moon began to rise, casting a pale, ghostly light into the canyon, painting the sandstone walls in shades of silver and black. It was a beautiful, serene light, a cruel mockery of her situation. In the moonlight she could see him more clearly. His head was slumped on his chest. Was he asleep? Unconscious? The temptation to try and slip past him was immense, a physical pull, but the risk was too great. The sound of a single dislodged pebble would be enough. Then, he began to move. He pushed himself up with his arms, hissing in pain as his broken leg shifted. He began to drag himself forward again, his progress agonizingly slow. He was coming for her. The waiting was over. "I can smell your fear," he rasped, the sound horribly intimate in the enclosed space. "Smelled it on you for years, like cheap perfume." He was 10 yards away now. The moonlight caught the crazed, determined glint in his eyes. This was the end point of all the years of flinching, of tiptoeing, of making herself small. All her running had led her here, to a final, inescapable confrontation in a stone box miles from anyone who could help. Desperation clawed at her throat, hot and sharp. She was cornered. There was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. Her body tensed, preparing for the pain, for the end. And then she saw it. Framed in the mouth of her small cave, just over Ezra's laboring form, was a shape. Darker than the moon-cast shadows, solid and immense. A head. The broad, powerful head of the black stallion. He was standing at the entrance to her hiding place, silent as the stone around him. He hadn't left. The herd may have moved on, but he had remained, a silent observer drawn by the lingering scent of conflict. His eye, a pool of intelligent darkness, seemed to be looking past Ezra, directly at her. He wasn't threatening her. He was just watching. Ezra, his focus entirely on the cave, on his prey, was oblivious. He pulled himself another foot closer, his breathing labored. Nowhere left to run, Nora. In that moment, something inside Nora Bell broke. But it didn't collapse into despair. It broke open. The years of suppressed fear, of swallowed anger, of silent endurance, ignited. The desperation did not curdle into submission. It distilled into a single, sharp point of defiant courage. She looked at the pathetic, broken man crawling toward her, then at the immense, primal power framed in the darkness behind him. An impossible, insane idea bloomed in her mind. A strategy born of utter hopelessness. She would not be a victim in this tomb. If she was going to make a sound, it would not be a whimper of submission. It would be a roar. Ezra was almost upon her, his hand reaching out. He was so close she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath again, even here in the clean desert air. Seeing the stallion's head motionless behind him, Nora made her choice. She took a deep, ragged breath, filling her lungs to their capacity. She opened her mouth, and she screamed. It was not a scream of fear. The sound that ripped from her throat was something else entirely. It was a war cry. It was a raw, primordial summons, filled with all the terror and rage she had choked down for years. It was a weapon, aimed not at the man before her, but at the greater monster behind him. It was a deliberate, calculated act of drawing a lightning bolt down upon her own position, hoping it would strike him first. The scream shot out of the small cave, shattering the lunar silence of the canyon, a beacon of human agony and defiance. Ezra flinched back, startled by the sheer ferocity of it, but the stallion reacted instantly. The silent, watchful head disappeared, and in its place was an explosion of motion. The great horse reared, his front hooves striking the top of the cave entrance, sending a shower of rock fragments down. A thunderous, enraged squeal echoed in the narrow space, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon. Ezra, twisting his body to see the source of the noise, had only a second to comprehend. The stallion lunged, not into the canyon, but directly into the shallow opening of the cave. It was an act of impossible physics, a force of nature funneling itself into a single, devastating point. The massive black body filled the entire entrance, plunging the small space into absolute darkness. The sound was a wet, percussive chaos, the shriek of a horse, the splintering crack of bone, a choked, gargling cry from Ezra that was cut off almost as soon as it began. The stallion's powerful hooves, shod in the iron of instinct, struck again and again in the confined space. It was not a fight. It was an execution. A storm of primal violence, a whirlwind of muscle and bone and fury, all concentrated on the space where Ezra had been. Nora was pressed against the back wall, making herself as small as a stone. Dust and the hot, metallic smell of blood filled the air. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel the vibration of the impacts through the rock at her back. It was brutal. It was terrifying. It was final. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The stallion backed out of the cave, his breath coming in great, heaving snorts. He stood for a moment in the moonlight, his powerful body trembling with adrenaline. He shook his magnificent head, then turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the canyon, his hooves making almost no sound on the soft sand. A profound and heavy silence fell, a silence deeper than any that had come before. It was the silence of a finished thing. The dust began to settle, and the pale moonlight once again filtered into the mouth of the cave. Nora, trembling uncontrollably, waited. She listened for a breath, a groan, any sign of life. There was nothing. The monster was gone. The only thing left in the cave with her was a crumpled, silent shape, a testament to a justice far older and more final than any human law. Nora didn't know how long she sat there in the dark, her back pressed against the rock, listening to the absolute silence. Time had dissolved. There was only the before and the after. The before was a lifetime of fear. The after was this vast, terrifying, empty quiet. Finally, the trembling in her limbs subsided into a deep, aching exhaustion. Slowly, cautiously, she crawled forward, out of the small cave that had been her hiding place, her prison, and now, the site of her liberation. She did not look at the shape on the ground. She kept her eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlit sky visible between the high canyon walls. She emerged from the cave into the cool night air. It felt impossibly clean, fresh. She took a deep breath, and it felt like the first true breath of her life. The world felt new, rendered in sharper focus by the trauma. The silver light on the sandstone, the scattering of stars in the strip of sky above, it was all achingly, terrifyingly beautiful. She stood for a moment, a solitary figure in the silent canyon. Then she began to walk. She walked past the place where Ezra had first blocked her path, her bare feet sinking into the soft, cool sand. She squeezed through the narrow entrance and was out, back in the open desert. The land spread out before her, vast and serene under the moonlight, no longer a place of threat, but of profound, stark peace. The walk home was a dreamlike trance. Her body was a catalogue of pain, her feet raw, her back and ankle smarting, every muscle screaming with fatigue. But her mind was strangely calm, empty. She moved automatically, her internal compass guiding her back toward the distant, solitary light of the ranch house. The sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, were no longer frightening. They were just sounds. The desert had taken what it was owed, and a balance had been restored. When the shambling silhouette of the ranch house finally appeared, a dark blot against the horizon, she felt no fear. It was just a building. Wood and wire and dust. Its power to terrorize her was gone, buried in a canyon miles away. She slipped through the fence and crossed the yard, The front door was still ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, in the same chair Nora had been so desperate to escape. The whiskey bottle was gone. The table was wiped clean. A single kerosene lamp burned, casting a warm, flickering glow. Her mother looked up as Nora entered, and her face, for a second, was a mask of pure terror. Then, as Nora stepped into the light, the terror dissolved, replaced by something else. A deep, soul-shaking relief that went beyond words. She stood up, her movements stiff, and rushed to Nora. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask where Ezra was. She just wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her with a strength Nora hadn't felt in years. Nora buried her face in her mother's shoulder and let the last of the tension drain out of her. They stood like that for a long time, two survivors clinging to each other in the quiet kitchen. There were no tears. It was a moment too deep for them. When they finally pulled apart, Nora's mother gently touched the gash on her daughter's back, her expression a mixture of pain and fierce resolve. Without a word, she led Nora to the bathroom, sat her down, and began to clean her wounds. She worked with a quiet, focused efficiency, her hands gentle but sure. As she carefully tweezed the last chola spine from Nora's ankle, she looked up, and for the first time in as long as Nora could remember, a real smile touched her lips. It wasn't a big smile. It was small, tired, and deeply sad. But it was there. It was real. 2 days later, a dusty county sheriff's truck rolled up to the house. Sheriff Morrison was a man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same desert rock as the canyons. He was world-weary, his eyes holding a pragmatic understanding of the darkness people were capable of. He had received a call. Ezra Blackwood hadn't shown up for his intermittent work at a neighboring ranch. No one was surprised, but it had to be checked on. He sat at their kitchen table, accepting a glass of water from Nora's mother. He asked his questions in a low, even tone. Had they seen Ezra? Did they know where he might have gone? Nora's mother answered simply, "He was angry. He rode out. He hasn't come back." Her voice was steady, clear. The sheriff looked at Nora, who sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. He saw the healing cuts on her feet, the faint bruising on her face. He saw the way she met his gaze without fear, without guile. Her eyes were old, filled with a knowledge that a girl of 16 shouldn't have. He saw the change in her mother, the absence of the constant flinching fear he'd noticed on previous unrelated visits. He nodded slowly, taking it all in. "Sometimes folks just ride out," he said, more to himself than to them. "This is a big country. Easy to get lost if you're not careful, or if you're drunk." He finished his water, set the glass down, and stood up. "I'll organize a search party. We'll check the usual places, but the desert, it has a way of holding on to things." He walked to the door, then paused and turned back, his gaze resting on Nora once more. There was a silent communication in that look, an acknowledgement of truths that would never be spoken, of a justice that operated outside his jurisdiction. "You and your mom take care of yourselves." He tipped his hat and left. They found what was left of Ezra a week later, not far from the canyon, his body claimed by the sun and the scavengers. The official report listed the cause of death as exposure and animal predation, likely coyotes, after a fall from his horse. The broken leg supported the theory. The case was closed. Sheriff Morrison chose to let the desert keep its secrets. Life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet rhythm. The house slowly shed its atmosphere of dread, like a snake shedding its skin. Nora's mother began to hum as she worked in her garden. She started wearing brighter colors. She smiled more. They didn't talk about that night. They didn't need to. It existed between them as a shared, unspoken foundation upon which they began to build a new life, one splinter and scar at a time. The house was no longer a place of fear, but a home they were reclaiming, piece by quiet piece. Weeks turned into months. The fierce heat of summer softened into the gentle warmth of autumn. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, Nora stood at the edge of the property, looking out at the vast expanse of the desert. A cool breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of dust and creosote, and on that wind, she heard it. A faint, distant sound. The sound of hooves, a herd, running free somewhere in the deepening darkness. She closed her eyes. The sound no longer held any terror. It was not a harbinger of pursuit or a thunder of judgment. It was just a sound, as natural as the wind itself. It was the heartbeat of the wilderness, a wild, untamable lullaby of freedom, a promise of the hard-earned, heavy, quiet peace that was finally truly hers.